I am on page 31 of the textbook, and we're still reading about historical texts. So these would be mostly in social studies passages, not always, but usually. So let's take a look at this passage. This is on page 31, the examples. And actually, before I read this passage to you, let me pull up the description of a primary source. Let's just go ahead and read at the top of that page. A primary source is a historical text that was written at the time of the event by someone who witnessed or experienced it. Primary sources contain vivid details about the time period, as well as the people and places. For example, the following passages are parts of a letter written by a nurse named Lucient on October 17, 1918. She writes to a friend in her hometown of Haskell, Kansas. So let me go back to my passage, and I did remember to get the picture here. So this is Lucient at a water pump. You can see that she's wearing the mask. Look at the tents behind her. Those were the living quarters at the time. Look at her uniform. That gives you a clue about the time period. Even the shoes give you a clue about the time. Another clue that's very important is the presence of these quotation marks. This means that someone is speaking word for word. They're speaking directly. It's a direct quote. So let's read this direct quote by Lucient. As many as 90 people die every day here with the flu. Soldiers, too, are dying by the dozens. So far, Felicity, C. Zane, and I are the only ones of the Indian girls who have not had it. We certainly consider ourselves lucky, too, believe me. Catherine and I just returned last Sunday evening from Camp Humphreys, somewhere in Virginia, where we volunteered to help nurse soldiers sick with the influenza. We were there with some of the worst cases, and yet we did not contract it. This is a primary source because Lucient witnessed this with her own eyes. She saw what was happening. If you can isolate or pick out the details of this story, it will help you to see that she's seeing it from firsthand experience. Another clue is the present tense verbs. People die as opposed to died. Are dying. Are. Consider. Now here's a past tense verb. When she says, Catherine and I just returned last Sunday evening from Camp Humphreys, where we volunteered to help nurse the soldiers. We were there, but we did not contract it. So she does switch to the past tense, but it still is written at a different time in history. I can infer that this is 1918 because I know that this flu attacked the population in that time period. I know that soldiers were sick during that time period. So it doesn't tell me the date, at least not in this passage, but I can infer that it was 1918 as opposed to present day 2022. Okay, here is more of that letter. We had intended staying much longer than we did, but the work was entirely too hard for us. And anyway, the soldiers were all getting better, so we came home to rest up a bit. We were day nurses and stationed at the officers' barracks for 6 days and then transferred to the privates' barracks or hospital and were there for 4 days before we came back. All nurses were required to work 12 hours a day. We worked from 7 in the morning until 7 at night, with only a short time for luncheon and dinner. So again, this is more of that letter from 1918. The quotation marks indicate that this is a primary source. And here's a question. Where did the nurse work first? So this type of structure is not cause and effect. It's one of our timelines that we drew. I'm not going to fill this in, but it is this kind of thinking that you have to do. And we want to know where the nurse worked first. Okay. Choices are, she worked at home, she worked at the officers' barracks, she worked at the private's barracks, or she worked at the hospital. So let me mark the details that we're interested in. She mentions that they came home to rest up. Be careful though, just because it's mentioned first doesn't mean it happened first. We were day nurses stationed at the officers' barracks, then transferred to the private's barracks or hospital, and were there for 4 days. So it looks like the officers' barracks were first, then the private's barracks, and then they came home to rest. So first, they would have been at B, the officers' barracks. So the question itself is a sequence question or a chronology question. And you have to use those skills that we've already covered to be able to answer that one. And I think I will pause the video and start a new one so the next section is not too long.